Hello, I am Greg Sundstrom, City Manager for the City of Grand Rapids. Welcome and thank you for coming. We're here to share with you the results from a race-based traffic stop study that was conducted by Lamberth Consulting of traffic stops that occurred here in the City of Grand Rapids by our Grand Rapids Police Department. At the outset here, I want to gratefully acknowledge the important conversations about police and community relations that have been taking place in our community for the past 2 years. I'd also like to thank Mary Beth Jelks, who was the project manager for this, and the Citizen Oversight Committee that have been tracking with us from the beginning of this process for their dedication and assistance in guiding this project. Those members were Dr. Walter Brame, Tyrone Bynum, Dr. Elizabeth Hoffman, retired Police Sergeant Terry McGee, Reverend Nate Moody, Gustavo Rotondaro, I always mess it up, Rotondaro, and Mindy Asasi. In 2004, the city conducted a traffic stop study which showed that the police department did not have racial bias in its traffic stops. One of the recommendations of the 2015 12-point plan to strengthen community and police relations was to update the 2004 study. Recent community conversations are crucial to our growth, as we have acknowledged with many residents and community groups that helped us to develop this 12-point plan that the only way to move is to move forward together. Because you can't improve what you don't measure, we commissioned this study to measure the degree of racial bias in our policing. The city wanted to know, are we treating all residents equitably? Unfortunately, the findings of this study are far inferior to what we had hoped. In fact, they are troubling and disappointing. The study shows that the Grand Rapids Police Department stopped black motorists at a rate higher than other motorists at intersections throughout the city. And following those stops, our police officers are searching black motorists at a higher rate. These disparities in how we police must end. This is contrary to the values held by this community. We will hear the details of the report shortly from our consultants at Lamberth, but first I wanted to be clear that these findings are especially disappointing because we do not believe they reflect the heart, current policies, and the priorities of this city. It is important to note that this study gives us a review of traffic stop data prior to 2015. And that's when we adopted the 12-point plan. We have taken several meaningful steps since adopting the plan, and we are confident, let me underline that, we are confident that given time, with the recommendations that are being put forth by Lamberth Consulting, we will be able to move forward toward eliminating racial bias in our policing, but we still have a long ways to go. While the findings of this report are troubling, we do not shy away. We have a lot of work ahead of us. In fact, I see this as an opportunity. We now have a clear mandate for change. The City of Grand Rapids accepts all of the findings that you will hear today from Lamberth, as well as all of the recommendations that they put forth as well. We are committed to working with the community to address bias in policing. Today we will hear from Dr. John Lamberth and Washtenaw County Sheriff Jerry Clayton, both from Lamberth Consulting, as well as our Police Chief, David Rahinsky. After we hear from the folks at Lamberth, the Chief will talk about the impacts of the changes that we have already made and how we plan to move forward to address the persistent problems identified in this traffic stop study. Following Chief Rahinsky, we will take questions from the media. For everyone else, we will have an opportunity to answer your questions this evening and tomorrow evening at our community events. Now I'd like to turn to Dr. John Lamberth to begin reporting our results. Dr. Lamberth?
Thank you. We conducted the 2004 study, and we conducted this study, and we want to explain a bit about the study and then some of the results and recommendations. So could we go to the first slide, please? The heart of the study and the heart of the methodology is that we take traffic stops at specific locations in the city of Grand Rapids. We use traffic data for a 3-year period from 2013 to 2015 at 20 locations around the city. The race ethnicity of drivers at those locations was determined by surveying on randomly selected days and times of day. We did this surveying from August until November of 2016. We had surveyors out at all hours of the day and night, and they went back to each location on multiple occasions. So we knew what the stops were, and we knew the race ethnicity of the people stopped at those specific locations. We knew what the traffic was at those same locations, and we compared them. We compared the proportion of minority stops to minority drivers. Pardon me. In addition, the proportion of minority motorists searched was compared to the proportion of minority motorists stopped. And I should say, searches are a very rare event. Actually, the searches the high discretion searches, which we looked at, consent searches and probable cause searches, occurred around 5% of the time. Further, the hit rate by race ethnicity for searches was determined, and let me be specific what a hit rate means. A hit rate is simply how often is contraband found when a search is conducted. And we did that by race ethnicity over the 3-year period. So we are not looking at the searches at the 20 locations. This is for all of the data of the Grand Rapids Police, and we are computing the hit rate on the same basis. Black motorists are stopped at a higher rate than would be expected by their presence in traffic. For 2013 and 14, black motorists are 1.85 times more likely to be stopped than expected. Now let me say something about the 1.85. The statistic that is being used here is known as the odds ratio. The theoretical neutral point of the odds ratio is 1. So we have worked over the years, and as we know that there is variation within all of the measurements that we take, we have taken the position that an odds ratio of 1 to 1.5 is benign. 1.5 to 2 indicates a problem with a more serious problem as it gets closer to 2, and a definite problem when it's 2 or above. In 2015, black motorists are twice as likely to be stopped than they were expected to be, which means the odds ratio for all 20 locations was 2. Here are the locations. You can see that they are scattered all around the city of Grand Rapids. You can also see, if you look at those odds ratios, that there are 16 of them that are above 1.5 and 10 of them are above 2. That means that there are 4 which are in there, 28th and Breton, Alpine and Sylvia, Lake Eastbrook and Sparks, and Division and Alger, which fall in the benign or lower area. And I do want to say a word about Lake Eastbrook and Sparks because it is the real outlier here. The odds ratio is 0.48, so what it means is that fewer blacks are being stopped there than would be expected by the number in traffic. And so we took a look at that location, and we found 2 things that sort of set it apart from other locations. The first was that there were 76% of the stops that were made there were made by 3 officers. This is not unusual in our experience. Officers have places they go to conduct their stops, but this one is a bit extreme. The second issue there, or the second thing that we noticed, and it probably is more important than the number of officers who made the stops, is that overall, in the city, about 37% of the stops are made for moving violations. 93% of the stops at Lake Eastbrook and Sparks were made for moving violations. So this puts it at quite a different place in among the 20 locations. Now, when we go to searches, black motorists are searched far more than their presence among motorists stopped. Please note now that we have moved from using a comparison group of the motorists in the traffic, for which we did for stops. Now we're using the proportion of motorists stopped as a comparison group for those who are searched. And we know that among black motorists, they were stopped more than we would expect them. And then on top of that, they were searched more than would be expected based on those who were stopped. I think a very important point to note here is that black motorists are no more likely to be carrying contraband when searched than are non-black motorists. And let me say that is something that we find in a lot of places around the United States. While there may be a myth that black motorists are carrying more contraband, it is not empirically held in that way. Okay. Let's look at Hispanic motorists now. The overall odds ratios for stopping Hispanic motorists in 2015 was 1.3, which falls in the benign area. At 5 locations, Hispanics were overstopped, and we recommend that GRPD should take a look and keep an eye out on those locations to try to determine why that is happening. Hispanic motorists, in contrast to black motorists, were searched at about the rate they are stopped. So there was no over-searching of Hispanic motorists. And Hispanic motorists were carrying contraband at a somewhat lower rate than were black and white motorists. And that, again, is also consistent with data we have from other places in the United States. Hispanic motorists are, in some places, carrying at the same rate as black and white motorists, but in many locations it's a lower rate. Now, if I may, I will turn the stage over to Jerry Clayton, who is my partner in Lambert Consulting.
Okay, so good afternoon. So talk a little bit about our recommendations. So our recommendations based on a number of things. After John has finished his analysis and conclusions as it relates to the data, we look at whether there's what we believe to be a systemic issue or if it's more of an individual issue. The other things that influence our recommendations are what are the best practices just nationally around providing police services, and what have we seen have been some of the successful efforts in some of the other engagements that we have had where we have found disparate treatment and agencies have engaged in certain recommendations to have reform, and quite frankly where they haven't engaged in reforms and where there's been continued issues. So to that end, we have provided, I believe, 12 recommendations. The first one is that the city and the police department immediately moved to analyze their 2016 data. If you go back on what John presented in terms of their 2013 through 15 data, we see a continual rise in terms of the odds ratio. The question is, does that rate continue to increase, or do we start to see a reduction in terms of the disparate treatment? And that's important because it's been referenced by the city manager that the city has already moved forward with a 12-point plan. That plan includes some specific actions by the police department that the chief will reference. You know, it includes body cams and some other things. The police department is already engaged in some training. They've had a one-day training, at least a one-day training. The chief will talk about other training, but one-day training for procedural justice, achieving cultural competence, and understanding implicit bias. So the question is, have some of these interventions started to change the culture and behavior in the organization? We will qualify the first recommendation with this. If it is systemic issues inside the agency that requires organizational change, we know that that takes place over a longer period of time. So if you look at the 2016 data and there's not a dramatic change, it does not mean that the trend is now starting to reverse. It means it hasn't started to take effect. Which brings us to the second recommendation, which is for the city to continue to analyze and report their stop data results. So what we mean by report is report it publicly. So if you look at 16, you would anticipate as we start to put some of these recommendations in place that starts to change behavior. Over a period of time, you would expect the numbers to change. We believe the only way to know that is to continue to analyze the data and report it publicly to the community. I want to jump down to the last bullet point because it also talks about data collection. So if you're going to continue this process, and when we look at our report that we presented today, it's narrow in scope because we want to answer a specific question. Our recommendation is as you continue to analyze, collect and analyze the data, that you broaden the scope a little bit. And what we know is this is an issue around discretion, a high discretionary activity. So it's not just the traffic stop, but it's the activity after the traffic stop, and we'll give an example or two. So who gets taken out of the car, who gets handcuffed and put in the back seat, when does a K-9 get called out? These are things that we know historically through our experience are questions that people ask. There's the opportunity, if you continue this process, to expand the data that's collected to get the appropriate elements collected in the right way so the analysis of those type of questions can also be included in the study moving forward. I want to go back up to the fourth bullet point. When we look at an organization and we make recommendations, we look at three primary pillars that we know impact organizational change. It is the direction that they get from their leadership, and that usually occurs in the context of written directive, which is policy and procedure. We also know that there's training. So when expectations are rolled out to an organization through policy and procedure, then there has to be appropriate training to make sure staff have the knowledge and skills necessary to meet those expectations that are rolled out in the policy and procedure. The third pillar is we also need to assess whether there's been some kind of impact, right? So management and supervision. Talk to you a little bit about recommendations that cover those three pillars. The fourth bullet point talks about we recommend that the city and the police department look at relevant policies and procedure. Not all of their policy and procedure, but policies and procedures that are relevant to traffic stops and post-stop activity, and that they see if there's anything in their written directives that may contribute to behavior that results in disparate treatment. To go farther in terms of that recommendation, we recommend that the committee that looks at the policies and procedures consists of the chief and his staff. We also representatives at all levels of the organization, from the frontline police officers to the mid-level leadership. We also recommend that at least one member of this team that's going to review the policy and procedure be a member at large from the Grand Rapids community. And the final recommendation as it relates to the committee members, that they employ the services of an external police expert. someone who has expertise in the police services field that can provide some assistance to the police department, an outside perspective that helps them look at those policies and procedures in a comprehensive manner. Next recommendation, if we look at the second pillar, is around training. So I'm going to hit 2 points on training. That first bullet point talks about training relative to what we call in-service training, so veteran employees. So they've already been through some training, but what we recommend is that the police department take a step back, look at all knowledge and skills that they believe impact traffic stops, decisions around high discretion, and make sure that all the training that they have results in bias-free policing. So in addition to implicit bias, in addition to fair and impartial, are there other things that the staff needs to be trained on that better positions them to perform in a way that does not result in disparate treatment on any particular group? I want to jump down to these last 2 bullet points because those bullet points speak to new employees. So employees that leave a police academy that comes into a new organization, that first year is pivotal in terms of how they go about carrying out the rest of their career. And that training usually exists in what's called a Field Training Officer Program, or FTO program. We recommend that the police department and the city look at both the program and the officers that facilitate that program. Not from a technical standpoint, are they teaching specific tasks, but in conjunction to teaching the task, what kind of values, beliefs in terms of how we do our job and why we do our job is infused in that FTO program. So there's one thing to be competent from a task standpoint. There's another thing to carry out the task in a way that supports a strong relationship with the community and also results in bias-free policing. I'll go to the second bullet point that speaks to another thing that we know. So the organization can articulate a specific policy and written directive and training, but you want to make sure that you act in a way that supports that. And our point is simply this. So we're asking them, or we recommend that they look at their rewards system, their recognition system, who gets promoted, who gets special assignments, because we know that in an organization, that communicates the priority. So the criteria you use for rewarding, recognition, promoting, and giving special assignments, that's really is communicated to the organization of what the priority is. So you want to make sure there's alignment between what we say we're about as an organization and how we want to treat people, and then how we actually carry that out on a daily basis. And a key part is that particular section. As it relates to early warning systems, so the Grand Rapids Police Department already has an early warning system in place. They have the software in place, and I'll try to be brief. An early warning system is simply this. You identify certain criteria and certain thresholds that allows you to identify when a staff member is behaving in a way that is inconsistent with what the organization's expectations are. And we know historically in this profession that if you intervene early, you're more likely to correct that officer's behavior and get it in alignment with the expectations, as opposed to missing those early cues, and then it results in some kind of incident that derails their career. Our recommendation is that they take that same approach as it relates to traffic stops. Now, this is a key part, because what we're recommending now is you've looked at the data in its largest form from a systemic standpoint. We recommend now that you drill down to the officer-specific level and the unit-specific level. So now you can start to identify who may be behaving in such a way that results in this disparate treatment. Now, we will give one caution here. This is where people think that there's a witch hunt. So everybody gets a little concerned, because now we're talking about going down to the officer level. What we're saying is you go down to the officer level, but not for the purposes of getting rid of someone. It's for the purposes of identifying who they are, so you can provide them the necessary coaching, training, and support, so they perform in a way that does not result in bias-based policing. So we'll repeat again. We believe this is critically important, but for the purposes of identifying those staff so you can support them, coach them, and train them so they will behave in a manner that's consistent with the expectations of the city, the police department, and the community. The second bullet point talks about conducting community engagement sessions. So this is not new to Grand Rapids in terms of engagement sessions in the community. What we are recommending that they are targeted. So to start now, you've rolled out the report. Now let's have conversations that detail in greater that provide in greater detail what the report means, what it is and what it isn't, and also continue that engagement to where you're bringing in now community members to help identify what strategies that the police department, the city, and the community need to put in place to have the kind of relationship between the police and the community that everybody desires. Initiate regular community feedback surveys. We recognize that the city has already started down the path of their racial equity program, and within that program, they're doing surveys. There's an opportunity to include the police department in those surveys. The caution here is simply this. Because it's a different service that they provide to the community, if you're doing a community feedback survey, you must make sure that the questions are designed in such a way to elicit the kind of response that gives you the insights you need to provide the right kind of services that are expected. So the feedback surveys are important, but how they're done with the right questions is really what's critical. And the last recommendation that we have is that the city and the police department commit to informing the community about the recommendations that they've received here, what the plan is moving forward, and that on a biannual basis, the city and the police department report publicly to the community the progress they've made in those recommendations. That concludes our report.
Good afternoon. I just want to give a little context to what you've already heard. You've obviously heard a lot of information. So departmentally, I think it's important to remember how we got here as a community. The events of the summer of 2014 were really a watershed moment for law enforcement. And here in Grand Rapids, in the Grand Rapids Police Department, we had some tough conversations about what we needed to do next. Ultimately, that resulted in our 12-point plan. We've now concluded 11 of those 12 points. The traffic study was the 11th. So with the traffic study, I think what's important is to remember that the last traffic study that's recorded in this study occurred almost a year and a half ago. So while that in no way diminishes from the results, it's important to realize what we've undertaken in the last year and a half. We've implemented body-worn cameras completely and for every sworn officer in the police department. We've begun our training process. We've had training with Lamberth and Associates. We've also brought in outside fair and impartial training, police training, which was a 2-day course that we undertook with members of the NAACP, the Urban League, the Hispanic community, neighborhood associations. The other thing that we've looked at, and I think that we've enjoyed some good results, is the hiring paradigm. We'd like ultimately for this police department to reflect the community it serves. So we took a hard look at who we were hiring and how that process worked. Ultimately, that resulted in the most diverse class that we've ever hired in the Grand Rapids Police Department, that being our most recent group. So looking at the recommendations moving forward, what we need to do is embrace these recommendations. We own this report. There's no shying away from that. This report it's reflective of what's occurred in the past. What it's not going to reflect is us moving forward. The last 16 months have shown that in terms of the steps that we've already taken. By embracing these recommendations, having some of these additional difficult conversations with other stakeholders, enlisting the services of Lamberth to help bring these issues to the forefront, and now use them moving forward to take a look every year at how we're doing so we can benchmark our progress. We don't want another 12, 13 years to pass before we take another hard look at where we stand in terms of bias-based policing. Ultimately, our objective is to provide bias-free policing for the entire community so everyone feels equally protected and equally served.